Hello everyone, welcome back. Excuse my sweaty, disheveled look. It's 112 degrees outside and I have been running around like a crazy person because we're leaving on a trip in a couple days, and you know, the logistics of a 10-ish day road trip with, well, I'm gonna say 6 kids. I have 6 kids, 4 of them are young, 2 of them are not. So we'll say 4 wild little kids. There's a lot of moving parts. So forgive me in advance. I'm trying not to be too crazy. No promises though, no promises. All right, so we are on part 2 of chapter 9 of Chaos by Tom O'Neill. And this next little section is called A Totally Irresponsible Individual. Even before I got the probation records, I was convinced that something was off about Roger Smith's relationship with the family. Well, yeah, if he's not only vouching for Manson, but his family as well, and fostering one of his children, that is fishy. That's fishy. And he's his only client at that point, which is also very odd. Like, it's just odd to have one, I don't know what the correct word is. Probation, one person on probation. What's the correct word for that? Probate, I don't know. It's weird. It's suspicious. One of many suspicious things. That's the thing with this book. Like, any one of the little weird things on its own, you might be like, no, who knows? There could be some reason we just can't see. But there's so many weird little things. That's why it's so intriguing. So anyways, let's keep going. My interest in the federal officer coincided with my deep dive into COINTELPRO and chaos. I hope my dogs don't go crazy this time, guys. I apologize too, because they do sometimes. I try to cut it out, but it's almost impossible to completely cut it out. COINTELPRO and chaos, both of which were active in the Bay Area in 1967. I wanted to know everything about Smith and Manson. How would Smith become Manson's parole officer? Because he wasn't his initial parole officer. That's interesting as well. Why were they so close? And what made Smith so inclined to treat Manson like a harmless hippie rather than a dangerous ex-con? The answers came mainly from a pivotal chapter in Manson's life, one that Bugliosi glossed over in Helter Skelter, The Summer of Love. From the late spring of 1967 to June 1968, Manson lived in Haight-Ashbury, the hotbed of the counterculture. Given how often Manson is characterized as a curdled hippie. A curdled hippie? That sounds weird, huh? It's like curdled milk. Gross. What is a curdled hippie? Let's find out. A perversion of the principles of free love. You'd think his year in the Haight would attract more attention. It was a crucible in which his identity was forged. He arrived there an ex-con and left a confident, long-haired cult leader. It was in the Haight that he began to use LSD. He learned how to attract weak, susceptible people and how to use drugs to keep them under his thumb. Who trained him to do this? That's the real question. And he internalized the psychological methods that would make his followers do anything for him. This might not have been possible without Roger Smith and someone else who we're going to learn about that also influenced Jack Ruby of JFK assassination fame. The two came together in a roundabout way. Manson had been released from Terminal Island Prison in LA County on March 21st, 1967. He'd served 7.5 years for forging a government check. When he stepped out that day, he was 32, and he'd spent nearly half his life in prisons and juvenile detention centers. As Bugliosi would marvel in Helter Skelter, prison supervisors had largely assessed Manson as nonviolent. Yeah, it's like, what changed? Obviously something huge changed. Though he faced juvenile convictions of armed robbery and homosexual RAPE, sorry, some words aren't allowed on here, guys, and had beaten his wife, these didn't add up in the eyes of the state to a sustained history of violence. I mean, that's kind of arguable. I don't think Joe Schmo is perpetrating those things on people, and if they were, be huge red flags, in my mind at least. Nor, as Bugliosi noted, did they fit the profile of a mass murderer in 1969. Another peculiarity All of Manson's prison time was at the federal level. That is weird. And again, we talked about it before. If he had just stolen a check, yeah, it's a crime, but since he stole it from a mailbox, that made it federal. Since he stole a car and took it across state lines, that's what made it federal. I think he came on the radar of some of these federal intelligence people in federal prison. That's my opinion. You guys tell me what you think. Bugliosi found this startling. Probably 99 out of 100 criminals never see the inside of a federal court, he noted. Manson had been described as criminally sophisticated, but had he been convicted at the state level, he would have faced a fraction of the time behind bars, maybe less than 5 years versus 17. Within days of his release, Manson violated his parole. Unless he had explicit permission, he was supposed to stay put. He was forbidden from leaving LA under penalty of automatic repatriation to prison, which never did happen, and multiple times it should have, or did not. Practically immediately, he headed to Berkeley, California. Years earlier, Manson had had his parole revoked just for failing to report to his supervisor, which is how it usually is. Now, for some reason, the police bureaucracy of an entirely different city welcomed him with open arms. When he called up the San Francisco Federal Parole Office to announce himself, they simply filed some routine paperwork, transferring him to the supervision of Roger Smith, an officer and a student at UC Berkeley's School of Criminology. Helter Skelter is deeply misleading on this point. Bugliosi writes simply that Manson requested and received permission to go to San Francisco. The prosecutor had a copy of Manson's parole file, so he knew this wasn't true. I wanted that file too. After a FOIA request and months of negotiations and appeals, I received a portion of it in 2000. It contained a letter from the San Francisco Parole Office to the LA office, dated April 11, 1967. 3 weeks after Manson's release, this man called our San Francisco Federal Parole Office to announce that he had been paroled and was now within the city of Berkeley, California, the letter begins. He had no parole documents. He impresses us as a totally irresponsible individual, in parentheses. The institution at Terminal Island tells us this man was paroled on March 21st, 1967. He was paroled to the Central District of California, which is LA. Since this man indicates his intention to stay within the San Francisco metropolitan area for the indefinite future, we now indicate our willingness to accept transfer of supervision to this Northern District of California. And so began Manson's assignment to Roger Smith, whom the ex-con came to revere. As the months passed, Manson granted Smith a special role as protector in the abstruse mythology. Abstruse, I'm not sure what that means. Abstruse mythology he begun to construct around himself. The Haight had introduced him to Stranger in a Strange Land, Robert Heinlein's provocative 1961 sci-fi novel. Manson was obsessed with the book. He carried a worn copy with him at all times. I don't know anything about this book. Maybe I'll look into it a little bit. I don't know if it influenced him at all. It makes me a little bit hesitant to do that. Maybe I'll read a summary of it and let you guys know. But maybe it'll give us a summary here. Let's find out. And though he was barely literate, he seemed to grasp the nuances of its dense narrative and its invented language. That is weird if he's basically illiterate. Seems interesting that he'd carry any book with him at all times. There's no saying who might have read the book to him or told him about it, but in its hero, Valentine Michael, I believe that's what he named one of his children, Manson recognized himself, so much so that he named his first child after him. Roger Smith got a nickname for Manson too, Jubal Harshaw. I'm guessing that's a character, Jubal. The most important character in the hero's life, his lawyer, teacher, protector, and spiritual guide on earth. That's interesting. The plot of Stranger in a Strange Land has eerie parallels to Manson's rise, so much so that after the murders, fans of the novel went out of their way to disavow Manson's connection to it. I could see that for sure. Probably the author, if he was still alive, was probably like, no, thank you. Valentine Michael, a human raised on Mars, is endowed with hypnotic powers. He descends to Earth to foster a new and perfect race. This is weird. Guarded by Jubal, he assembles a nest with about 20 others, almost all women, whom he initiates through sex. This does sound a lot like his story. He demands that his followers surrender their egos to him in a spirit of total submission. Get ideas from this book. They worship the innocence of children and yearn to exist in a state of such pure consciousness that they can communicate telepathically. The group sleeps and eats together. One of their most sacred rituals is the act of sharing water, which takes on vaguely druggy undertones. In Valentine Michael's philosophy, there is no death, only discorporation. Killing people saves their souls, giving them a second chance through reincarnation. Now, I recall seeing interviews with like Susan Atkins. Like they said that they didn't see the murders as, something bad, but as freeing them. So I wonder if this sounds like where they got the idea for sure. The group begins to discorporate their enemies with impunity. In time, Valentine Michael draws strength from the nest and, like Christ, saves the world. I don't remember Christ discorporating anyone. After the family was caught, Time magazine picked up on the bizarre parallels between Stranger in a Strange Land and Manson's own nest. In January 1970, it ran a piece called "A Martian Model?" arguing that Manson had no powers of invention at all. He may have murdered by the book. I know what else this Stranger in a Strange Land author wrote. He's probably horrified that this happened. Or not. If you write weird stuff like this, maybe you wouldn't be horrified by it. I don't know. Like sometimes I think that, when I was younger, I tried to read some Stephen King novels, and I've only gotten through a couple of them because I just got this creepy feeling like, oh my gosh, what would Stephen King do without this outlet of writing and writing such horrific things? And like, how did these ideas come into his mind? I don't know. It's my own opinion, but it seems like you have to be a little off to write stuff like that. I don't know. I get the same feeling watching certain movies. I remember watching this movie called Seven. Sorry, I'm on a tangent again. And I could not even, personal anecdote, but it was before my husband and I were married, but he was living with us in my brother's room. And we were not allowed to sleep in the same room, but I did not care. We watched that movie, and I was so scared that I snuck into his room. My brother was not occupying, just my husband. And I was so scared from watching that movie, only because I was more scared that someone in this world living with us that at that time thought up something so heinous. Like, it just, I don't know. Anyways, I snuck in there and slept with my husband against my parents' wishes. I was such a rebel. I was not a rebel at all, but that was a rebellious act for me at the time. Okay, back on track, guys. Oh, you guys have to let me know if these tangents bother you. They probably do. I try not to, but I just can't help myself sometimes. But Roger Smith was amused by Manson's fascination with the novel. He thought it was good that Manson saw his own fantasies in it. There was no harm in his desire to become a savior. If that meant that Smith himself took on the role of Jubal, so be it. When we spoke, Smith was hazy on the details of how he became Manson's parole officer. Manson had been assigned to him as a part of the so-called San Francisco Project, an experimental parole program funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. So really, Manson was a human experiment, sounds like to me. It monitored the rehabilitated progress of newly released felons. When Manson arrived in the Bay Area in March 1967, he was attached to the program and to Roger Smith. Manson's participation in the San Francisco Project has never been reported. Well, gee, I wonder why. In part, it explains why the two men had developed such a powerful bond. because Smith spent much more time with Manson than the average parole officer would. The project studied the relationship between federal parolees and their supervisors. Researchers wanted to know how varying degrees of oversight affected recidivism rates. Well, if you're not letting him get put back in jail, how are you calculating recidivism if he should have gone back to jail several times? It's the very definition of recidivism, right? Recommitting crimes after you've been released from jail, right? The 6 participating parole officers, which makes you wonder what other parolees were involved in this, and did they do anything shady? They must have. If it was the same program. I don't know. I would love to find that out. Watch it be like a bunch of weird serial killers or something. We don't know. That's a rabbit hole I might have to, well, I'm sure they won't. All that information, I just have this theory that they destroy information as much as they can if it's something damning like this. I mean, this book was written not so long ago, and we're just now finding out some of this stuff. Right, a lot more stuff buried. The 6 participating parole officers, all of whom had advanced degrees in criminology, were assigned one of 3 caseloads. Normal, averaging about 100 clients. Ideal, numbering 40 clients. Or intensive, 20 clients. Okay, so it says Roger Smith fell in the middle group, so ideal. So he had 40 clients at one time. Eventually he whittled way down to having just 1. Maybe they started out high, and then if they had a particular parolee that showed some sort of promise, I don't know, promise in a dark way, then they whittled it down. I don't know. Let's see if they tell us. He met with his clients once a week per project guidelines, but at some point his ideal caseload became even more intense than his colleagues' intensives. Yeah, so the intensives had 20. By the end of 67, he'd winnowed his set of parolees from 40 down to just 1, Manson. I was shocked that Manson had become Smith's one and only client, but I could never figure out why. Hoping to learn more, I interviewed Smith's research assistant from that time, Gail Sadala. Although Smith had assured me that he'd never met Manson before becoming his parole officer, Sadala had a different recollection. It's like Queen Elizabeth said, our recollections may vary. Smith told her in 1968 that Manson became his charge because he'd already been his probation officer years earlier. In the early 60s at the Joliet Federal Prison in Illinois. Admittedly, this seemed all but impossible. Manson had never been in the Illinois parole system, and he'd only been incarcerated in the state for a few days in 1956. Maybe that's all it takes, though, to get earmarked for something like this. But Sadala was convinced that the two had met previously. When I told her that her former boss had no memory of meeting Manson before 1967, she was stunned. He didn't remember that, she asked. I'm surprised. It was always my understanding. That's why there was this connection. And connection's written in italics, so it must have been weird to her too about how intense the connection was. I didn't know what to believe, but if Sadala was correct, it might explain how Manson was able to move to San Francisco without being sent back to prison for violating the terms of his parole. He may have been sent there. That is every bit the vibe I'm getting. Because, just meander into a completely different part of the state and easily get your parole transferred over, especially when it says that he seemed shady and irresponsible to them. There had to be somebody greenlighting it, right? All right, the next section is called Wipe Your Eyes and See. As a doctoral student at the Berkeley School of Criminology, Roger Smith studied the link between drug use and violent behavior in Oakland gang members. In April 1967, the study had seen enough success to merit a press conference. As the New York Times reported, Smith and his colleagues had found that a gang's drug use, rather than mellowing them out, more often triggered violent behavior. The students wanted to distinguish between gang members who fell into violence because of inherent sociopathic tendencies and those who became sociopathic because of drugs. Smith conducted research through his own immersion. He and the other researchers created outposts in the Oakland slums, hanging around at community centers and churches, befriending gang members under less than transparent circumstances. They embraced a participant-observer approach to social research, which Smith would further incorporate into his methods in the years to come. Human experimentation, once again, by unwilling or unknowing participants. By 1967, Smith was regarded as an expert on gangs, collective behavior, violence, and drugs. Manson, his one and only parole supervisee, would go on to control the collective behavior of a gang through violence and drugs. So maybe Roger Smith should have been incarcerated right along with Manson. He was the one to blame for training him, although if it was under this program, I don't know how else to, I think of like, you think of like Nazis and stuff, like they were under a program too, under a regime, ordered to do things, and many of them were, tried and convicted, put in jail for the rest of their lives. I know this is not the same as Nazi Germany, but on a very much smaller scale, you could make that argument, I think. If you're influencing someone to commit atrocities, it's kind of the same thing, right? Okay, so Manson moved from Berkeley to Haight-Ashbury, crashing wherever he could and never paying rent. The hippie movement was nearing its high point. Bohemians were dispensing with boundaries, giving away clothes, drugs, sex, music, and hours of talk about tolerance. Anarchists called for the end of racism, capitalism, and imperialism. The mere act of picking up a guitar had a new ideological voltage. The length of your hair said everything about you. Drawn by the psychedelic aesthetic, teens flocked from around the country to get laid, to try to bring enduring peace to the world, or to try pot and LSD, and to not do anything productive for society, let's be honest. The latter of which had only recently been made illegal in California. It was a concerted grassroots effort to reject middle-class morality. But where some saw earth-shaking radicalism, others saw only Dionysian excess. George Harrison of Manson's life-defining band, The Beatles, stopped by the Haight that summer and came away unimpressed. The Summer of Love was just a bunch of spotty kids on drugs, he said. A press release for the Human Be-In, a sprawling gathering a few months before Manson came to town, gave a sense of the era's transformative rhetoric. A new nation has grown inside the robot flesh of the old. Hang your fear at the door and join the future. If you do not believe, please wipe your eyes and see. Okay, so that's all a quote from a press release for the Human Be-In, like not being, but like love in, sit in, be in. I never heard of it before this. When Manson went to wipe his eyes and see, he wasted no time adopting the folk ways and postures of the flower children. Once he landed in the Haight, he dropped acid on a daily basis. It took just one trip to foment the most abrupt change that Roger Smith had ever witnessed in one of his charges. Manson seemed to accept the world after LSD, Smith wrote. So there are some of Smith's writings on Manson out there. I wonder if him being so malleable to the effects of LSD is what made him take him on as his only parolee. Maybe it's like, oh, this is our guy. This is the one that's influenced enough by this that we can do what we want to do with him. I don't know. I'm just speculating, but it's possible. Seemingly overnight, he transformed himself into an archetypal hippie, his worldview suddenly inflected with spiritualism. He grew out his hair and played guitar in the street, panhandling and scrounging for food. Although only in his early 30s, he presented himself as a father figure, attracting young, down-and-out men and women as they embarked on the spiritual quest that had led them to the Haight. If Manson was eager to portray himself as Jesus, then Roger Smith would have been John. According to one of my sources, no one knew Manson better than his parole officer did. It would be surprising if Smith didn't know that his ward was breaking the law a lot. But he only had praise for his sole client. Mr. Manson has made excellent progress, he wrote in one of several reports he made to the head parole office in Washington, D.C. He appears to be in better shape personally than he has been in a long time. Smith wrote those words on July 31st, 1967. At the time, Manson was sitting in a jail cell. That's ironic. A few days earlier in Ukiah, he'd been convicted of interfering with a police officer in the line of duty, a felony. He'd been trying to prevent the arrest of Ruth Ann Morehouse, one of his newly recruited underage girls. Though the charge was reduced to a misdemeanor, Manson was given a 30-day suspended sentence and 3 years probation, which he was already on parole, so how do you get probation stacked on top of parole? I think if you're on parole and you violate it, then you go back to jail. That's my understanding of the system. The arrest merited only a footnote in Helter Skelter, and Bugliosi didn't say that it resulted in a conviction. Instead of being sent back to prison, Manson, who'd been out for only 4 months at that time, was back on the streets again in a few days. Probably with a little help from Roger Smith, my guess. That incident continued the distressing pattern of amnesty that Roger Smith could never explain. I don't know if anyone tried to get him to explain it before Tom O'Neill delved into it. In part, Smith benefited and continues to benefit from a veil of secrecy. Manson's complete parole file has never been released. And again, why not? It's been so long. But it's probably because of all the implications that will be made from it. The government doing shady stuff. And these programs that are just, unconscionable, really. You're human. You're experimenting on humans, and lives are being lost. All in the name of what? Research? I guess. Mengele was doing research too in Nazi Germany, right? It wasn't even permitted into evidence during the trial, which is very surprising. During the death penalty phase, the defense's Irving Kanarek had subpoenaed the file, hoping he could use some part of it to argue for his client's life. Not only did the United States Attorney General John Mitchell refuse to release it, he dispatched David Anderson, an official from the Justice Department, to aid Bugliosi in his effort to squash the subpoena. Once again, there is a theory by Tom O'Neill and others that Bugliosi was selected because of his shady past, because they knew they could basically blackmail him into doing things how they wanted to, because he had a criminal past too. Remember, he thought his wife was sleeping with the milkman and that their child was the milkman's child, and he basically tortured the poor guy and used his resources as an attorney to do it. So they probably were like, hey, if you don't want this to come out, you're going to play this the way we want to. I don't know. The more and more you hear, see if that rings true to you. It was an almost unprecedented action. During death penalty arguments, when a defendant's life hangs in the balance, anything that could be introduced to save that life is routinely allowed into evidence. In the courtroom, stunned that the government wouldn't allow Manson's access to his own file. Yeah, this is Manson's attorney that's trying to get it to defend him, and they're saying no. That's very surprising. Kanarek asked Anderson if it contained information that would incriminate the Attorney General. Bugliosi objected. The judge sustained, and Anderson didn't have to answer. Ultimately, the judge upheld the prosecution's motion to squash the subpoena. The file was never allowed into evidence, and the whole episode was excluded from Helter Skelter. But why? The 55 parole documents turned over to me, later 69 after exhaustive FOIA appeals, by the Federal Parole Commission, represented only a sliver of Manson's total file, which was described as 4 inches thick at his trial. Still, those pages have enough raw data to show that during Manson's first 14 months of freedom in San Francisco, months during which he attracted the followers that became the family. He was given virtual immunity from parole revocation by Roger Smith. Under Smith's supervision, Manson was repeatedly arrested and even convicted without ever being sent back to prison. It was up to Smith to revoke Manson's parole. It was ultimately his decision, but he never even reported any of his clients' violations to his supervisors. So yeah, Smith is the linchpin here, right? Sounds like. In interviews with me, Smith claimed not to have known about Manson's conviction in Ukiah, even though it had occurred under his watch. In fact, in the same July 1967 letter, which should have mentioned Manson's conviction, the letter that lauded his excellent progress, Smith requested permission for Manson to travel to Mexico, where he would have been totally unsupervised in a different country. What? For a gig with a hotel band. Smith failed to note the fact that Manson had been arrested in Mexico in 1959, resulting in his deportation to the United States and the revocation of his federal probation. This Smith dude is shady, shady, shady. When I interviewed him, Smith claimed not to know about the Mexico arrest. Manson is not to leave the Northern District of California, the parole board responded, noting that Manson's history does not mention any employment as musician and that his record was lengthy and serious. Okay, so somebody has some sense at least. And yet, 2 weeks later, Smith tried again. He really wanted to send Manson to Mexico. He told the parole board that Manson had been offered a second job there by a general distributor for the Permagard Corporation of Phoenix, Arizona, named Mr. Dean Morehouse. Dean Morehouse is little Ruth Ann Morehouse's dad, and that dude actually lived in the Cielo Drive house after the murders for a while. So that's weird, right? He wanted Manson to survey the market for insecticides, soil additives, and mineral food supplements. Okay, so is he a musician or some kind of soil scientist? Smith did not mention that Morehouse was on probation. Regulations barred association between them. And one of Manson's newest recruits, the father of the 15-year-old whose arrest Manson had tried to prevent 3 weeks earlier. Again, it's that board, that little spider web of connections. The parole board rejected his second request too. Interestingly, at the same time Smith made these requests, he launched a criminology study of Mexican drug trafficking for the federal government. So he probably wanted Manson to traffic some drugs while he was at it. I don't know. Or to see if he could get him to do it. Maybe that was part of the experiments about recidivism. I don't know. He'd attempted to send Manson to Mazatlan, which was the main port city of Sinaloa, the drug trafficking capital of Central America in the 1960s. And I believe to this day as well. In hindsight, Smith told me, when I presented him with the documents, it was not a good decision. Then he reversed course a bit, saying that he probably made the request just to show Manson they wouldn't let him go. Doubtful. But twice I asked, and at the expense of your own credibility? He erupted. If you want to be conspiratorial, he said, yes, I was doing research on Mexican drug trafficking at the same time I was trying to send him there. So yes, you could make it look like that, but that wasn't what it was. Don't believe your own eyes or your own common sense. I wasn't a career PO. I only did it for a couple of years because I needed the money while I did my dissertation. My wife was a teacher, but we had no money. Was I a career committed parole officer? No. Committed or not, Smith had official responsibilities, and the paper trail, in its sparseness, suggests that these didn't much weigh on him. After those 2 Mexico requests, Smith generated only 2 more documents regarding Manson for another 5 months. Both were simple form letters authorizing Manson to travel to Florida to meet with recording agents. Those interested me for several reasons. First, they violated Smith's orders from Washington. He was to forbid Manson from leaving the Northern District of California under any circumstances. That's pretty clear, any circumstances. Second, from my examination of the documents, it seemed that Smith had post-dated them, suggesting that he wrote them after Manson had already left town, safeguarding him from another potential violation. And third, there's no sign that Manson and the family ever actually went to Florida. Say, you're in California where the music industry is pretty hopping. I assume it was at that time. I guess I don't know, but I wouldn't think Florida would be more of a opportunity for him from a music standpoint. I guess I could be wrong, and I don't know what the music scene was like in the 60s in Florida, but it seems weird. If they went anywhere, the only available evidence suggests it was to Mexico. Smith's letters are from November 1967, on the very day that Susan Atkins' probation officers were frantically trying to prevent her from traveling. She, Manson, and the others were pulling out of San Francisco in their big yellow bus with permission from Roger Smith. Manson was required to send postcards to Smith. There's no record that he did. Now, what is a postcard going to prove? I guess there's the postmark that says that you got there. But that doesn't seem like much of anything. Is that enough to check in with your parole officer, sending a postcard from Florida/Mexico? Weird. Later, probation reports noted that Atkins and Mary Bruner had said they spent quite a bit of time in Mexico with Manson that winter. Otherwise, their whereabouts for November and December 1967 are entirely unaccounted for. Interesting stuff, right? Okay, so like I said, someone again commented in one of my one of the episodes from this book. They're like, oh, please finish this book soon. I want to move on to the next, because they're not watching this series because they said they lived it. They lived through the whole Manson crimes and stuff. But I really hope that people will eventually go back to these, because this is not really giving an account of what happened. That's out there and been done. This is the other side of it. Well, you guys know, you're here to watch it. But I'm just hoping at some point some of the holdouts will go watch it so they can learn stuff that they didn't know, because I didn't know any of this. I don't think most people knew any of this before this book came out. Before I saw Tom O'Neill on the Joe Rogan Experience, I was like, what? As soon as I heard him talking about this, I'm like, I have to go read this book. So maybe it's on me for not selling it well enough, or the dastardliness of Manson and people being like, I don't want anything to do with that. But anyways, I don't know why I'm even blathering this to you all since you're here to watch it, but maybe I'll say it in the future. It'll probably annoy people. I don't know. Anyways, what do you guys think about this? There's definitely something shady with Roger Smith. Why did he go from having 40 clients to just one? I think I don't know that I'll put anything on here. But you all know I like my rabbit holes, and I might do a little more research on the San Francisco project. I wonder how much is even out there to be learned. Like I said, so much stuff just has disappeared over the years, and we're unlikely to ever see it again unless it's, sitting in a dusty file cabinet somewhere, and on the offhand chance somebody finds access to it like Tom O'Neill did with this stuff. I mean, that was such a serendipitous thing that he was able to do that, because we probably wouldn't have this book at all. We wouldn't have much of the information that we do. So what do you guys think? I don't know. Roger Smith, like I said, who just gets to foster a child without going through the hoops? Who goes, and how did he influence the other family members that he had nothing to do with on paper and get them getting released from jail? It doesn't make sense. There has to be something bigger, right? There has to be a bigger plot or conspiracy or whatever you want to call it. Maybe since these people were adjacent to Manson, and maybe there was something written into the project about that too. It's so hard to say. All we can do is speculate. Like I said, we'll probably never know, but I will see if I can find anything else on it. I kind of have my doubts, but anyways, what do you all think? Hope you're enjoying this. Thanks for sticking around. Hope you're all staying cool. Like I said, it's 112 degrees out here, which I've lived here my whole life. I should never, I complain every summer though when it gets this hot. I do. I can't help myself. But probably those of you in colder climates do in the winter as well. Like, why do I live here? Oh my gosh, there's a little moth flying around. Sorry about that. All right, you guys take care of yourselves. I will see you soon. And I think I'm going to try to squeeze one more in tomorrow. Today's Wednesday. I leave for Yellowstone on Friday. So I'm squeezing in as many as I can. All right, you guys, I hope you all have a lovely day and see you next time. Okay, bye.